Wow.
Hey, that was fancy, wasn't it? Wow.
Wow. Major props to Lee for that beautiful intro.
Yeah, that was great. So this is the more than you realize. What do we call these things?
Is it a
Live video
video
cast?
podcast
Something
thing?
like that.
I don't know.
Ah,
There's probably a word and I just don't know what it is.
right, that's okay. So, but yeah, so yeah, we're gonna be like exploring like, how things are more than you realize, right?
It's a great way to introduce that. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think for myself, I I'm just a normal dude. I do work in the church, but I'm not a scholar or a theologian, but I am very interested in trying to live my life the best way possible. And I've got a boatload of kids that I would like to get on board with that too. So the idea that the topics that we'll talk about have more to them than just maybe the surface kind of exploration that most people do is something that I can talk and I can ask questions all day long about to try to get to the deeper parts of that. So that's kind of my putting that in a nutshell kind of explanation.
Did you actually say that you're a normal dude?
Yeah, I mean,
Wow. So let's
normal.
start. Let's start with the glasses. Explain
Well, it
white
was
glasses.
yeah, it was very unintentional, and it was unintentional in the sense that I've worn glasses since I was in third grade, and I went from the early 80s like big brown plastic frames that everybody had, that there's all the memes about on social media that make fun of that, and they were horrible, they were hideous. And then as time went on, I moved into black frames, and I loved the black frames, and I had those for many years. And
I
then
remember.
yeah, so
You
and
you had
then
that sort of adorable look, but it's
nice,
from the
adorable.
90s.
That's great. That's great.
I know I shouldn't say that because that's something that maybe a girl would say of you. But if I were a girl, that was kind of the look. You had your
Well,
little thing on
I
your
did. I had my
chin,
little soul patch,
your
and
little shaved head, and your
I
big
did. I
kind of
did.
black horn rimmed
And
glasses.
and what's funny is that I'm always on the tail end of a trend. Like I'm not I guess you could call me a more skeptical person. I don't jump right on board with the bandwagon. If there's a fad that's going on, whether it's in music and culture, movies, whatever, I always kind of wait until the initial craze happens, and then I kind of explore it and jump on board. I'm not a big bandwagon person, and so when I had all of these things, the soul patch and that whole look, it was probably after that look was really cool, and I was the person that's
Gosh, I
still
must
hanging
really
on
be
to it.
behind the times because I thought you were so avant-garde, so
Well, thank you. I
so
appreciate
cutting
that.
edge.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what do I know? I just am kind of a boring sort of.
No, you got your own sort of crunchy granola-ness to you.
Well, I'm from the Northwest. I mean, what
That's
can I
right.
say?
That's right.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
but getting back to the white glasses. So I discovered online glasserias or whatever you call them, and it's where you can choose, Zenny and Warby Parker and all of these amazing, this option now that you go to the doctor and you can get your prescription, but you don't have to spend hundreds of dollars at the doctor's office to get your glasses. So I discovered on Zenny, these were in the men's section, and I'm scrolling through, and I'm picking like a couple of black frames, putting them in my cart, and then I discovered, one out of the thousands of men's frames, there was this white pair. And, and I'm a bit of a creative person. And so my wife kind of tolerates that for the most part. And and I put
Yeah.
it in my cart, and I'm like, I don't know, Becky. I don't know. Like, I'm really tempted. I've always worn these black frames. Maybe I should go with something different. And she's like, yeah, go ahead. Go for it. That's you. That's really you. And so I tried them on. You can try them on. And whenever I tried them on the digital thing, they really blend it in, you know. And I was like, oh wow, that really like just kind of fades in, and
The
so
gray, it's the gray hair.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm not even gonna
The
show you
gray and the
that
gray
the
beard. Yeah,
Corona
don't please. That
non
would be scary.
haircut.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I get them in the mail.
I'm not sure what style that cut is that you have right now.
It's bad. It's just called it's like Untamed Lion is what it is, and it's all hidden under
Yeah,
this.
it's kind of like a lion's mane that's sort of like gotten wet.
Yeah. An untamed drowned lion. So, but anyway, I get them in the mail and I put them on, and you know, I look up in the mirror and I'm like, oh my gosh, like the contrast was not what I was expecting whatsoever. I was very much deceived by the online trial of this. But
and you never look back.
I haven't looked back because I'm a big, like, if I buy it, I'm invested into it, you know, and I'm not going to just turn my back on it. So anyway, I've been wearing these for, I don't know, four years maybe. And it's become a bit of a branding thing for me now. In fact, I'll run into people at the grocery store out in public and they have no idea who I am or what my name is, but they're like, I've met you before. I've seen you before.
You're
and
the
it's
guy
like,
with the white glasses.
it's the white glasses. And I'm like, yeah, yep, that's me.
Yeah.
I don't really have a name.
I have the privilege of being your friend. I know you personally. Wow, that's amazing.
It's like when I'm out in public with my kids and they'll be like, oh yeah, you're so-and-so's dad. Like, I don't have a real identity of my own. It's either my glasses or I'm somebody's father. But,
you are the father to many. That is for sure.
I am. Yeah. I do.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, you are not a normal guy, and I suppose that's why, we're doing this together because, we've been friends for a long time, and we kind of hit life from different angles. So hopefully that'll be interesting as we dive into some of these topics that we want to, take on, trying to help all of you out there to realize that everything around you is more than you realize. So today we're going to talk about Christian virtue and the coronavirus. So here's how I'm going to tee it up. So I've been really struck by, like, there's a group of Catholics out there who are being extremely critical, not only towards the government, but towards our bishops for, sort of like shutting down the masses. And the accusations that I hear from some of these, so it's interesting. Let me just qualify it this way. There are many Catholics who just think what the government's doing is exactly what it should be done, and they feel safe and they feel good about the fact that someone's looking after their health. And then there's this other contingent of Catholics who kind of, the underlying message is that we're just kind of wimpy, everybody's overreacting, and I can kind of understand the difference in those perspectives, but there's also sort of a subgroup of the latter that I just described that think that priests and religious and different people should just be out there and not afraid of contracting the illness, regardless, because the faith is just first. And so, you should just be willing to die, for the sake of receiving the Eucharist or giving the sacraments. And so I think it's an interesting question. What is our obligation? How should we respond to this? And what's the bishop's responsibility in all of this? And so let me just offer you my first thought, and then, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. But so I'm thinking, like, okay, I'm the bishop and I'm looking at my presbyterate, right? And I'm thinking, okay, good or bad, the median age of my priests is pretty old. And most of my priests are not in the greatest of health. So I got two things going on. If the law tells me that I'm supposed to do this, then there's the question of, is this good of me to be disobedient to the government? And I want to get into that in the show today. By going ahead and having religious gatherings against what the governor of the state of Pennsylvania says, and the president, is that a good thing? And then secondly, even if I was permitted to do this, given the fact that this virus seems to be pretty fatal to people who are not necessarily strong health-wise and are older. And I'm looking at my presbyterate and I'm the bishop and I'm saying to myself, there is a sort of calculated risk. If I just say, hey, carry on with your duties as usual, my priests are going to be dutiful and faithful to that, presumably. And a year from now, I could end up potentially with half of my priests. And so this is something I've been thinking about. I've been trying to think, well, what would I do? Like, what would I do if I was in the bishop's shoes? And I have to say, the longer I think about it, the more I pray about it, the answer is not so clear to me, because there's different competing goods in this whole thing. So anyhow, that's sort of tease it up. I'm curious to know, kind of like we've talked a little bit about this, it's kind of privately, but I'm curious to know sort of your thoughts or sort of where your thinking goes on this.
Yeah. Wow. My gosh, there's so much packed in that. This kind of goes back, I think, my own personal thoughts might be one thing. Trying to figure out the reasons that somebody else has for their reaction to this is a totally different thing. I think everything you're talking about, like the bishop's response and trying to be prudent, knowing that he's got an older priesthood, knowing that the virus is especially more deadly for older people and people with bad like preconditions. I can understand that, but I also I do think it raises the question, like you teed it up about talking about Christian virtue and the question of courage, and like what does that look like in a response to this? And I think that you can look at any number of different things that have happened in the past. Like, for instance, let's talk about Nazi Germany. Like what was I would be so interested to know what the general response of the church was, maybe from the leadership being like the bishops, and then also how the priests went about that. That's obviously it's a very different kind of thing. But it speaks to this idea of, what level of courage, what level of putting yourself out there at the cost of, with a virus, of catching the virus, with something like Germany, of death. I mean, and also with the virus of death. And that's something where there's something very inspiring and heroic about people who put themselves out there to the point where they're risking death. But I don't know. Of course, I'm not convinced that God calls every single person to put themselves out there in that kind of a way. So I definitely don't think it's a one size fits all kind of thing. And that, for me, the better approach is, how can we look at what's going on immediately around us? Can we work within the confines of what the state is saying is acceptable, but still offer speak to the spiritual needs of our people? I mean, there are people out there that are just hungering to get back to church, to receive the Eucharist, to go to confession. And I know we recently started that, but I think the critique, you're seeing some bishops that seem to be acting much more maybe what would be considered heroic, where even though the church is deemed an inessential organization, they're still trying to figure out very actively how to minister to the needs of their parishioners. So I didn't really give much of a concrete answer. I guess I'm
well, no, I'm not sure there is a straightforward answer. It's complicated. I mean, there's a lot of things that we have to take into consideration. And, one thing that comes to my mind is, what are we obligated to choose for others? Let's just go back to World War II. Here's a really good example. A lot of people wanted Pope Pius XII to, speak out very vociferously against the Third Reich. And so he did. And then very short order in the Netherlands, about, I think it was like 65,000 people were decisively killed in response to his public statement. So at what point, on the one hand, someone say, well, that's just the way it goes for being a Christian. You just might have to step up and be a martyr. But that's a difficult choice to make on behalf of the person who's responsible for those people, to decide for them. And so going forward, he chose to be more quieter and to work more subtly. And he's drawn down criticism, but of course, like I wasn't in those shoes. It's easy to play armchair quarterback, in other words, and say, "Oh yeah, this is what you should do," but you're not the one in that position. And
Sure.
And I think it's always a good practice. I think of Christians, empathy and understanding, to say, well, if I was in that position of authority, I'd have to think through what are the things that I'm responsible for, and what do I have the right to choose for others or not choose for others. So I think if masses stayed open during this time, I want the mass to be open. I'll be honest with you. I think a lot of this has been somewhat of an overreaction. Some people are very much in agreement with me. Other people think I'm cold and insensitive and heartless. I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And maybe we, I would say prudence would dictate that we should try to be a little bit more specific to the region and to the area. And there needs to be some differences between, say, rural places and, New York City. There's just vastly different scenarios going on in those places. And it's really up to competent authority to make those judgments and decisions. But so, you step into the position of the bishop and say, okay, well, if I leave the masses open and everybody's to go to mass, then the implication is that mass becomes an obligation for me to attend. And what if I'm vulnerable? And how do I decide, I guess if I'm a pious person, I say, oh, I'll be fine, and so I go to mass, and meanwhile we're spreading the disease, on the other hand, people would say, and I think this is a legitimate point too, like, people are big enough to make those decisions for themselves. And if we had masses going, people who were vulnerable and in a vulnerable population should, you could communicate clearly and say, hey, if you deem that you are a person who it has an underlying condition or is susceptible to having a bad reaction to coronavirus, then by all means you're dispensed from your Sunday obligation, or you're dispensed from, obviously if you need to go to confession, let's make arrangements for that minimizes the risk to you, and so on and so forth. But at any rate, it's from the standpoint of prudence, which you brought up, and knowing what the right thing to do. It's difficult because you kind of have to understand all the circumstances, and you have to have a certain degree of foresight to say, well, if I go this way, what are all the possible things that can happen and go wrong, and if I go this way, what could that scenario look like? So yeah.
Let me ask you this then. I personally, I probably would tend to fall more on the side of let me make that choice about what I think is best or right for myself or my family, versus somebody else imposing that on me. And I understand that. So for an older person or a person who might be one of the at-risk people with this virus, the encouragement is that they pull themselves away from the rest of society for a while, and just sort of give everybody else the option to take a calculated risk for themselves. I think the hard part for people, and people obviously fall on different camps of this, of how much do I need to be told what is best for me for my own protection, and how much of that can I make on my own terms and decide that for myself. And this goes with, oh my gosh, it extends into many things beyond just this virus, like government laws, things like that are kind of passed down to us. And I think the issue of prudence is a really big one, and I don't think there's a general one size fits all thing. And I think probably what we're seeing at this point in response to this virus is that many people are frustrated because it has been a blanket approach, a one-size-fits-all approach, and people are frustrated, especially like you said, outside of big metro areas. Even in the Pittsburgh area, they haven't seen nearly the cases that the health organizations were expecting them to see, and so kind of enforcing that same type of response and mentality onto Pittsburgh that, let's say, they did for London or Los Angeles or New York. Just, I think people are kind of I don't think they're seeing prudence in that. I think what they're seeing is probably unnecessary fear, or like an overreaction to fear about this. And those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think that the one size fits all. I mean, let me just make this comment. In general, as a general rule of thumb, people only become prudent by practicing the virtue of prudence and having to decide between alternatives which are not clear. And part of this is the reason why we need the virtue of prudence is because there isn't a rule that applies to every circumstance in our life. In fact, most of the decisions that we make in life don't have a rule that you can apply immediately. Especially when it comes to, like navigating like what I would call a minefield, where it's like there's a whole bunch of complex factors that come to bear on a decision. And there's outcomes that you can't always foresee or anticipate. And so prudence is a virtue that actually allows you, to be able to have a deeper sense of how to navigate complex situations. And so when we don't practice that virtue, we don't acquire it. And when we don't acquire it, we don't know what to do. And so we expect other people to tell us what to do. And I think in general, as a community, as a society, we've relied more and more on the government and authoritative bodies to tell us what to do. And so that can cultivate a lot of fear because we don't know what to do, or we don't have a sense of what's prudent. Now, this is kind of a somewhat new situation for us, so it's kind of understandable why, because we don't really know what this, especially early on, we didn't know what this virus had the potential to do. But I think the principle stands in general, that there's a principle in Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity, that we want a decision to devolve down to the lowest level that decision can be made. And so it seems like, there's probably some mandates that need to be universally applied, because we have to anticipate the fact that some people are just not prudent, right? And so I think about all the people that rush to the beaches, and we're on spring break, and all the infection that happened, and there was, that was not a great thing. People didn't exercise due caution in that situation. But at the same time, does that then necessitate that everybody stay home? That seems like a reaction. And I see this all the time, like in many settings and organizations I've been in, when a few people make a mistake or do the wrong thing, then you apply a rule that ends up kind of punishing everybody instead of dealing with the people that that had an issue. Now, in a situation like that, that's really hard. But again, when it comes to the virtue of prudence, it's important to make that distinction. And that's where it's like, I don't envy a ruler or a bishop or someone who's in this situation and has to make the decision. It's extremely difficult because, nobody in a leadership position wants to end up being the person that didn't do enough. Like if I'm in those shoes, ask yourself this question: would you rather be the person who didn't do enough and everybody criticized you, or would you rather be the person who got criticized for over responding and overreacting? I don't know. I mean,
a great question.
It's I mean, as a parent, I've done both.
Yeah. Well, what I see happening is it's becoming very clear, the people who are reliant on being told what to do, and the people who have, to go to different ends of the spectrum. I guess you have the blind compliance, the people that if that's what I'm being told by somebody who is an expert, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm not even going to question it. They know what's best for me. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I think you have the hyper individualistic people
Right.
who will respond and say, you know, I'm not going to let nobody's going to tell me what I can do. And no matter what it is, I'm going to make that decision for myself. And so you'll have the people that try to push just the simple things, like I'm not going to wear a mask into Walmart. I don't care what Walmart says. And they're the people that are holding up the line outside of Walmart because they're fighting with just some sad employee who has nothing to do with that policy.
Yeah.
And obviously that truth always lies somewhere in between the balance of individualism and being able to make decisions for yourself and just blind compliance. And I don't know how you teach that to people. Well, obviously I think that, in starting in the family, I guess by example, parents kind of living that well would be a good way to teach people. But, as a society, how do you teach people the virtue of prudence versus hyper individualism or blind compliance?
Right. Well, it's really, prudence is related to the common good, and it's how do you teach people to understand what the common good is and what the common good requires, and how do I serve the common good? And it's kind of a balancing act between, a kind of collectivist mindset on the one side that says everybody has to fall into the same pattern, everybody has to be, the same, and the state kind of owns every person. And we see some tendencies right now going on with this in our country. And on the other hand, there's this, this kind of rogue individualism where, people just think, I don't answer to anybody. I don't care if my actions impact other people. Well, both from a Christian perspective, both of those perspectives are totally wrong. So we have to be good stewards of ourselves, and there's a certain domain of freedom and the freedom of self-determination that we all have a right to. But all of our free actions as individuals they resound to the common good in some way. And so we have to be mindful and aware of how our actions might impact other people and then act accordingly. And to your point, to your question, how do you learn that? Well, you learn it in the home first and foremost. Right. And as a parent, I think one of the best things that I've tried to do in this regard for my kids is let them make little decisions that have minimal consequences. And even if they're the wrong, don't make that decision for them, even if it's the wrong decision. Let them make the wrong decision and then be there with them to learn the lesson of why that went wrong. Because that's how they learn prudence. You learn prudence by practicing the virtue of prudence, and you acquire it by making choices and then learning from the consequences of those. You have to have a good memory to be a prudent person. You also have to have foresight, good circumspection. You have to be able to look side to side and really understand what's going on in the situation. Well, obviously kids don't have that by nature. They have to be taught that. So parents can do a wonderful job helping children do that by learning how to let their children make decisions and then experience the natural consequences of those decisions, and then to be there alongside your kids saying, hey, what did you learn from this experience? Did you notice this? Did you notice that? Then as they grow up into adults, they don't necessarily need a law to tell them to not go to the beach and go party when a major world epidemic is beginning to spread across the globe. They might say, maybe that's not a good idea, but I don't necessarily need the state to tell me that because I have wisdom and I can do that on my own. I just choose to skip my spring vacation this year. But I want to tee up another virtue, the virtue of obedience. This is another one that I think gets people, stumped, and that is this, what's our obligation around being obedient to higher authorities, especially when we encounter a mandate or a law or a directive of some kind that in our minds doesn't make a lot of sense, or, maybe we even we just disagree with it. We think it's stupid. There's people I know that feel that way about some of these mandates. What's our obligation, do you think, as Christian people in regard to those kinds of laws?
Well, man, that's a great question. I would say that the first thing that comes to my mind is the scripture of, rendering to Caesar what's Caesar and to God what's God. So I do think that Jesus does specifically talk about a certain amount of respect for state authority that we have to have. Certainly within that, I think there's some gray area. I don't think it's black and white, of course. I think there are laws that are Christians and Catholics would consider very horrible laws, such as the right to have an abortion. We have major disagreement with that. And I mean, you can even see this happening with the kind of society, the change in society towards acceptance of different types of relationships and marriages, and private businesses that have moral disagreements with that. Do I think that a bakery has an obligation to provide their services to anybody that comes into their store, which in a sense is, by doing that, I guess there's some level of support to that thing that you're doing, and by saying I can't celebrate that event or celebrate that kind of a thing, are they, do they have the good conscience to be able to disobey that law? Like, that's a really, really good question. My opinion, of course, is I do think there are laws that we shouldn't have to be forced to do, because they conflict with what we would consider to be an affront to our moral standards and our moral sensibilities. The other thing I wanted to say, and kind of turn a question on you, and you mentioned it earlier, and I think obedience ties in with this, is obedience to things that speak maybe about the common good, and what necessarily, like especially in this virus situation, you have a very small amount of the population, relatively speaking, that is most susceptible to the most dangerous manifestation of this virus. And then you have everybody else. And, the vast majority of people either are asymptomatic or they show very mild flu-like symptoms to this. And, but we're imposing this kind of response for everybody. And a lot of it is dressed in language of, well, we're doing this for the common good. And sometimes that's really tricky for me, because on the flip side of protecting that very small group of people, you are opening up a Pandora's box of all kinds of problems, long-term issues for people, unemployment. You're seeing a rise in things like domestic abuse, suicide, depression. These are things that aren't going to go away right whenever you decide to reopen society. So the common good in terms of obedience to these kinds of things, that's a difficult one. And again, I don't think you can just use a one size fits all for people. There's some real disagreement in that.
Yeah, no, well, that's for sure. And, again, this is why there are some decisions that only the wisest of the wise know how to make. And, one thing I will commend Trump for is just the fact that he's surrounding himself with different voices. We might not always agree with the conclusion of the outcome, that's being made, but he is trying to consult different people who clearly are not in the same political or ideological camp as he is. And hopefully we strike the mean, as best we can when we proceed in that manner. But it is hard. It's a question of prudence. It's like, how do you decide between goods? And, the wisest of us would be able to negotiate a path where you have to, in a sense, act on behalf of, those goods which have the greatest gravity and value. And then we can often foresee certain bad things that are going to happen as a result of that decision, but you can't always choose all things at the same time. It's very difficult. And, again, I know there's a lot of disagreements about how, we're doing this, this lockdown, and it's having, all these other externalities or these other, damaging consequences. And how do you kind of weigh those in the balance? And it's hard to say. I think, well, I mean, it's like one of these things where I can play this thought experiment and I say, okay, so we open things back up, the economy rebounds and everyone gets back to work, things reopen, it's August, it's September, we look back, we say, okay, wasn't as bad as we anticipated, like the virus. Like in retrospect, we look back and say, well, maybe this wasn't as bad as we feared it would be. Or you think, well, what if we had just left things wide open? I mean, I don't know. Maybe we would be burying millions of people right now. And, I'd love to say, oh yeah, that would never happen. But the truth is I have no idea what would happen. And so you do the best you can. And here, here's what I would say about, the virtue of obedience is that it's, the scripture is very clear to us that we are never obligated to obey a direct command that makes us violate the moral law. So
Dang,
the example,
you beat me to it. I wanted to say that.
So the example of the baker shop, there you have a case of a person who is being made to violate their conscience, that is to act in a way that clearly violates the moral law. And of course, no state has the right to legislate that because that's not really a valid, legitimate law to do that. However, there are many things that we might think are stupid or foolish or imprudent, which don't force us to act against our conscience, but they inconvenience us.
Sure. Like the mask going into Walmart.
Yeah. And so as Christians, and the entire tradition of our faith says, Christians are to be a model of obedience in those circumstances, that we, at the end of the day, subject ourselves to higher authority because that authority is established by God. And Paul says this in his 12th chapter, letter to the Romans, 13th chapter, it's right in there. He's talking about the importance of subjecting ourselves. And I always remind people, think about who he's talking about here. He's talking about the Roman emperors. He's not talking about benevolent, good leaders. He's talking about horrid, wretched people that are on par with Adolf Hitler. And he's saying that Christians are to be obedient and be a model. And why is that? It's crazy, but to think about this. But the reason is because there is a fundamental good in law and order. And if we take it upon ourselves and say, well, I'm going to decide what's a valid law for me to obey and not, right? That's just a recipe for anarchy and everybody doing whatever they please, and then undermining the good of law and order so that law and order has no respect. And so we can't, in one sense, we can't fault ourselves as Christians for being docile to the law, even though we might say, in prudence, I think some of this stuff is excessive and over the top, and it's terribly inconvenient and perhaps not even necessary. But so, I mean, just as ways of general principles, I think these are good things to keep in mind when it comes to obedience. On the one hand, we should never obey a law which directly commands us to do something that would violate the moral law. And then on the other hand, we have to put up with a lot of stuff that we think is nonsense and ridiculous as an example to legitimate authority, and recognition and acknowledging that in obeying those higher authorities, we're obeying God, because right. God established the legitimate authority. And as Christians, we take that takes humility, that takes the ability, excuse me. Let me get a drink of water because I'm getting a tickle. I know.
No, I'll go while you're drinking water. And I think that an easy summary of that is most of what we're seeing with the response and what the state expects of us in response to this virus is really just stuff that's inconvenient. There's different degrees of inconvenience, but nothing about it, at least that I'm aware of, is anything that we're expected to do that would go against the moral law. So wearing a mask, wearing gloves, doing all those all those things, no matter what you think of it, no matter what your opinion is about those things and how inconvenient or annoying they are, you're saying, and I would agree with you, that as Christian Catholic people, like that's a really good example of how we obey, authority, state authority, without compromising ourselves. We sometimes you're inconvenienced, but it's still a very virtuous thing to do.
Yeah. And now let me just here's another point though that I would point out again. This is just so complicated. There's so many facets to this issue, but one thing that I would say is really a problem, and I think as Christian people we should speak out about it, is the inconsistency that we see in the application of principles and rules. So the larger essential things are allowed to stay open, and people can walk in this establishment but not into a smaller mom and pop establishment. The small businesses, the small guys have really been hurt by this, I think. And again, that's where I think that we would say, okay, is there a way that we could have done this where there would have been consistency in the application of the rule or the rules or the mandates? So that, for example, why couldn't any business be left open with a little line drawn on the outside, and only, let's say your store is only 50 by 100 feet. So you can only let 3 or 4 people in at a time.
Sure.
They have to stay 6 feet apart, and you have to, what's easier to disinfect, a small business or a Walmart?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And, so apply these principles. And there I'd say, we probably wouldn't have, the economy would have been stronger under those circumstances if we had thought through some of those things. And I think that's a legitimate critique to say that this is, there's been some very creative ideas about how to keep business open.
Right.
And I've seen some small business say, the heck with it. Like I was at Convive Coffee in McCandless, and they're open. Like they created this kind of drive up system.
Right.
And of course, a lot of restaurants that drive-throughs have done that, but they didn't have a drive-through option. They created one.
Right.
And I think they're keeping their business alive. And so I just think that again, this is where subsidiarity and like the government, like the governors of the states could have said, okay, here are some general sort of mandates or rules that we all have to live by. Now you figure out how to apply them, and in your set of circumstances, understanding that our goal is to try to minimize the spread of this virus. We want you to stay open, but we also want you to so you're going to have to spend more time cleaning your facilities. You're going to have to limit the number of people that can come in your store. Everybody who comes in your store has to wear a mask.
Right.
Whatever, put up your shields, those plastic guards, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Now again, you might be a person that says, oh, all of that's ridiculous. We don't even need all of that stuff. But still, you're striking it's a mean, like it's a middle path between the extremes of a total uniform, should just be all this way, or on the one hand, it's a free for all. Everybody just do what they want, and
Yeah, I mean, I can totally understand the question of, well, why can I go through a Chick-fil-A drive-through and make contact with 3 different people? I'm using my card to punch in buttons or whatever it is, and then I drive up and I grab my bag. That's not, and there's a lot of contact going on there, but I can't, go to church, or I can't,
right.
Up until like this past week, I couldn't go to the sacrament of confession. It does cause you to, I mean, it brings up these legitimate questions of what consistency in how we're going about deeming what people can do and what people can't do on an authoritative level, like where an authority is telling us well, you can go through a drive-through and have the potential of coming in contact with many different people in that process, but we can't figure out a way to have you be behind a screen and listen to confession, or have communion distributed to you in a very prudent way. I think that's why people are very frustrated.
Right.
It's why they're getting very impatient with the process. So, I mean, patience, that's a whole other virtue, I guess we can talk about. But
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really important virtue to talk about right now, because we're undergoing a lot right now. We're enduring a lot. And it's, some of these things are what I would call sort of like physical evils. That is, sort of like just dealing with disease and death and things like that, And then on the other hand, there's other kinds of sins that are happening as a consequence of this situation. And then there's, the inconveniences we've talked about that we have to deal with. And so it takes a lot of patience. And I think Christians are like, God is really calling us to be patient. I mean, when Christ, we just celebrated Easter, Paschal mystery, and, Jesus had to be pretty patient in many of the similar ways. He had to put up with less than competent leaders. He had to experience contention, tension and contentiousness around him because of him. And I think, we've had to experience some of that in our communities, as people have different opinions, or being at home with your family members can try your patience, can it, Scott?
Yeah. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah. So yeah, we need a lot of patience during this time, and it's long suffering. That's another word for patience, and it's an important Christian virtue to learn how to suffer well. And of course, older people who are still around know that it's been a long time since we've had to do this.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
you
I think
lived
that
during the Great Depression or the war, whatever, Great War.
right. I think that it's maybe before this happened, it was easy for people to escape situations that may have required them to be patient. They could sort of dive into going to a bar. They could go to a movie. They could just leave. They could leave the situation, and not having those outlets or those means of escape so much anymore has sort of forced this idea of learning patience on people. And I mean, I think it's a really good thing, because I personally am a very impatient person, like especially in work situations. I'll get an inspiration and I want it to happen immediately, or I want somebody to see my way of things immediately. And impatience is constantly working against me. But I will say, especially in the family life, just being together so often, not having kids that are running to different activities. My wife and I would both be involved in different groups that we would meet with outside of our families, but just being there on top of each other constantly has really, really forced me to practice patience. Not at all very well all the time, but it's a realization. And I think that's the one thing that's like just realizing, okay, this is kind of a new reality, and I can't lose my cool, all the time, because you're going to be here. Like we can't run off. We can't go out and escape to where we normally would be. So just
Yeah.
it's been a hard lesson, but a good lesson.
Yeah, I have to say, I've been more intentional or thoughtful about how I respond to people in my family, because I don't want to trigger a chain reaction.
Right.
For that
right.
exact reason. It's like, okay, which is good. I mean, maybe I should think about being like that all the time, Um, so just being able to, like, just respond in love instead of react in frustration and even anger. And it can become disproportionate too, because, the more annoyed we become, the more we overreact to stupid, silly little things, which can accumulate,
Yeah.
How many times does my wife and I have to tell our kids to, clean up after themselves in the kitchen, when they're home all day? It's just like pretty soon there's not a single spoon left. Like we have like 24 spoons in our drawer, and it's amazing. It's like, really? Like you can't just use the same one, like,
Yes.
silly little things. All right. I want to sort of like start thinking about wrapping up here, but there's one other thing that I think would be really worthwhile talking about, and that is, as we think about this sense of solidarity with other people, how much as Christians do we have to be willing to sacrifice for the sake of others in this situation? You touched on it earlier, but we didn't really pick it up.
That immediately makes me think of something that I don't know if I made it up or somebody much smarter than me made it up, probably the latter. But for me, like, the gospel is inherently about challenge and being inconvenienced for Christ. Like if you're a Christian, if you're a Catholic, and you're serious about striving to live that, the gospel in your everyday life, it inherently comes with challenges. I've discovered that it's rarely ever about comfort. Like there's never a time where Jesus is like, I just want you to be in a comfortable little box and just stay there. And I do think if you're serious about it, you open yourself up to being inconvenienced for Christ, So I just can't help but think that it naturally comes with sacrifice. Like if we want to live it as best we can, we are constantly going to be asked to make sacrifices, to open ourselves up to personal growth and change. And that kind of flies in the face of, I think, the natural human reaction, which is just to find a comfy little spot in our life and just stay there, and build up as many barriers as we can to protect that level of comfort. So, I mean, and I don't know exactly, maybe specifically what level of sacrifice you're talking about, but I think across the board, finding ways to reach out to people, like our neighbors. How are we staying in contact with people? The maybe for many of us, the natural reaction would be like, this is great. I just love not having to be bothered with other people, and I can just isolate myself. But I think if we're serious about living the gospel and living the way Jesus wants to, that's not an option. It's not an answer for us. And I think you can apply that to almost everything. I don't know. That's just kind of my gut reaction to that.
Yeah, no, I it's interesting. In my mind, I'm like, I don't mind being, inconvenienced and making a sacrifice, for other people, as long as it's not something I agree with. And that's, I always catch myself like, as long as it's a worthy cause, then it's, to the ends of the earth. And, but then I go back and I think about Jesus' own life, and I think about his crucifixion. The whole thing was unnecessary. But he had to do it because we created the conditions that made it necessary in our sin and our imbecility and, ignorance and everything else. So it's like, yeah, I mean, most of the time, the sacrifices we make in solidarity with other people, the things that we do on behalf of other people, are not things that, they're things that we have to do, which we ought not to have to do if things were perfect, but right. It's precisely because, I have to help people that could help themselves, but aren't, I have to, I don't know. I'm at a loss for an example off the top of my head right now, but I mean, there's just so many things that it's sort of like, I love sacrifices when I choose them for myself, right? Sure. But that sort of undermines or works against. And so I think when we talk about solidarity, or we talk about Christian charity, or we talk about the service of other people, or mercy, so often we're being asked to love and to inconvenience ourselves and give ourselves to other people in a situation which is oftentimes on the other end is undeserved or undeserving. And we have to go back and think, well, that's entirely how God has loved me. I mean, he was pretty inconvenienced on the cross, for a while. And, in order, and I can think back in my own life, I think we all can, where we do things where we know better, but we do it anyway. And then we create a problem for someone else, right? And then, good people step through and help us through that situation and grow from that experience and whatnot. And so it's like, this is a time too, when it's just like when things, tensions are high, and, we just really have to practice mercy. We have to be in solidarity with one another, even if we don't agree, or we think that some of this is, whatever, overblown, like we've talked about, today.
Yeah.
One last thought. I was struck earlier when we were talking about, the Mass, what's essential, what's not essential. And, the bodily needs are essential, spiritual needs, clearly not essential. And it's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous, but it's very telling of our culture. And, our spiritual needs are essential. And I think one of the places where it really shows up is in fear. When people are really afraid of something, especially something they don't feel they can control, something that could take their life, I mean, that's where you feel the need for faith and religion and a relationship with God. And for us as Catholics, for the sacraments, we need the consolation, the comfort of God to overcome our fear and to face the unknown, present, future with courage, especially people who are unemployed right now. My gosh, some people can't go to work and they can't go to church at the same time. It's like, thank God for us in our grouping here, and I think all over the place, people are putting the Blessed Sacrament in view of people so that they can still adore our Lord there. And so, I encourage everybody to spend as much time as they can afford to be with our Lord, if not physically in the presence of our Lord in our hearts. I've been going for a long walk every morning, praying my rosary, just asking, just trying to draw near to Christ's heart and be as close to him as possible, so that I'm just a peaceful person in the midst of all this. I'm just at peace. I'm in his peace, and I can just spread that peace to other people, because what else can I do? I can't control 99% of what's going on right now out there. And so just praying for it. So anyhow,
Yeah.
Well, hey, thanks.
Yeah, beautifully stated, man. I couldn't really add anything to that. I totally agree, and that's why I love you so much.
Hey, I love you too, bro. Yeah, no, this is good. Well, this is a good conversation. So look forward to doing it again next week. We'll have to figure out what our next topic's going to be.
I'm excited.
All right. So, I think I'll end with saying that people often ask, what's more than you realize? And I always say, just about everything.
It's a great answer, and it's very true. Very true.
Yeah.
All right.
Take care.
All right, Mike. See ya.